Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to everybody that joined us tonight or today for this discussion with Kay Murali or Comrade Ajit, his new book of concepts and methods. So we have with us the acclaimed journalist KP Sethunath and Saurav Banerjee, who's the editor for Towards the New Dawn. My name is Christoph Kistler, so I'm one of the editor of the Foreign Languages Press. We are a small Marxist-Leninist publishing house, and we are dedicated to spreading relevant theoretical text to as many people as possible, and that for an affordable cost. So we already had the privilege to release two earlier books of Comrade Ajit, one being Against Avakianism, and now more recently Critiquing Brahmanism. So if you're interested, we recorded the previous book launches of this book. You can see them on our website. Now it's a great honor to have one of the leading Maoist theoreticians today with us, able to bring his new book. I would like to apologize a little bit for the long delay we had in bringing forward this discussion. We encountered many technical issues in organizing the event. But since we have the book in our hands, we didn't want it to disappoint you, and we still released it as promised last month. So hopefully that means that some of you watching today will have already got it, ordered it, and read it, and will be eager to ask Ajit some your burning questions about his essays during the Q&A session. We will go to a short video now to introduce the participants and then straight to the discussion. So during all of the event, we'll be collecting questions. There is a Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You can send us your question at any time, and after the discussion, comrades will answer to as many as possible. Maybe just keep in mind that Comrade Ajit is still out on bail, so maybe be careful on the question you're asking. Maybe you won't have answers to those more sensitive questions. And I hope that you will enjoy today's event. Thank you very much.
Kay Murali, also known as Comrade Ajit, is an Indian revolutionary adhering to Marxism, Leninism, Maoism. His political work, which upholds the politics of Naxalbari, can be traced to the 1970s, when he rejected the revisionist politics of the Communist Party of India, Marxist. In 1976, while he was an organizer in a rural area, he was arrested for an alleged attack on a police station and was detained for 2 years during the state's fascist emergency. In the years following his release, he played an important role in writing on ideological issues, on political economy, Dalit studies, Maoism, and the situation in the international communist movement. His work in those years contributed to the unification of Maoist forces in India. Arrested again in 2015, accused of being associated with the CPI Maoist, he is currently out on bail awaiting trial. While in prison, Comrade Ajit wrote many essays, some of which were published earlier this year under the title Critiquing Brahmanism. Others are included in Of Concepts and Methods, the book being launched and discussed today. Joining us today for the discussion is KP Sethunath, an historian and journalist who is a longtime road companion of the revolutionary movement in India. He's worked for over 30 years writing articles for newspapers such as the Press Trust of India, the Financial Express, and the Deccan Chronicle. His work led him to write a book, published in 2017, that documents the repressive regime of the internal emergency declared by Indira Gandhi in 1975. Currently, he is located in the city of Kochi, in Kerala, working as the executive editor to a web portal focusing mainly on the expatriate community from Kerala in the countries of West Asia. Also joining us is student activist Saurav Banerjee. He is currently working as an editor for Towards a New Dawn, a magazine from India that since its first issue in 2008 has been publishing theoretical analysis on the situation in India, interviews, and commentary on the global situation, and supports people's resistance internationally. Foreign Languages Press welcomes KP Setuna and Sourav Banerjee, as well as the author K. Murali, to today's discussion of his new book of concepts and methods.
Thank you for Foreign Language Press for giving me an opportunity to address a meeting on the discussion of this book by Mr. Ajit on concepts and methods. So as Mr. Kistler has already mentioned that this is going to be nearly an hour discussion based on the book, and then there will be a question and answer session. So I would like to begin the talk about this book basically on saying that this is one of those books which is coming out from a man who is involved in a revolutionary practice for the past 4 decades, and it's not one of those books which is coming from a purely academic background. It is not that I have anything against academics as such, but it is coming from a person who is actively involved in developing a kind of a revolutionary praxis in India, and as well as seriously involved in the ideological debates within the sphere of Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism in a global perspective. So, as the title of this book, and in fact, I would also like to show that this is the South Asian edition of the book, which has come out in Kerala, and I'm having a copy of it. And as the title of the book says, of concepts and methods on postisms and other essays, this particular book is more critic of what is called as largely known as postmodernism, which has emerged as a kind of a major ideological current across the world, including in India, especially in India in the late 1990s and early part of this century. So, Mr. Comrade Ajit is, although he's very is critical about this whole ideology going under this hubris called postmodernism, he is also of the opinion that some of these issues which has been raised by these proponents of postmodernism needed a kind of a closer attention and a closer scrutiny on many levels, and that is one of the main crux of this thing. And the position taken by Ajit in this regard, it needed a kind of a serious consideration on the part of the activists as well as the people who are committed to a kind of a politics of emancipation. And one particular, for instance, in the case of India, I would like to draw the attention of the attention of what is called the subaltern school of history writing, which has emerged in the Indian this thing in the early 1980s, and that was largely influenced. That is especially the first 2 volumes which came out in the early 1980s was basically influenced. They were basically critiquing the history writing, what is called the nationalist way of history writing, as well as the conventional Marxist way of history writing in India. And they were trying to bring out what is the kind of movements which has developed at the ground level, what they have called as a subaltern. And they wanted to position it as the mainstream writing of history as a kind of a elitist perspective, and the subaltern as something which is coming from below, something down below, the most downtrodden sections of the society. And particularly I liked the way one of the main authors of Subaltern School of History, Dr. Ranajit Guha's book on elementary aspects of peasant struggle in India. And that was surprisingly, that has given a kind of a new perspective about this whole idea of anti-colonial movement in India. See, before the British established their domination, their colonial domination in the province of the then province of Bengal in the second 1754 after the and if you look at the history of 1754 from 1857, nearly 100 years, all the movements, especially the militant movements against the colonial rule was from the, basically from the indigenous people, what is the people living in the forest areas, and which is normally called as tribal societies, tribal land. And there were very series of rebellions against the colonial domination in this thing. And before the subaltern school came, or before the advent of the subaltern school, this whole history of, even today, this whole history, its significance has not been properly understood by the history writing in India. And what kind of political subjectivity this particular revolts have been has brought forward. And mostly in the early part of history writing, yes, as well as the national history writing or the conventional Marxist history writing, all these rebellions by these indigenous people has been mostly classified as some kind of a pre-modern political, pre-modern movements. They were not being, and this whole idea of modern has been is quite problematic, especially in the current understanding. So, what is this whole modern is? So, this before the advent of the so-called Indian national movement led by the Indian National Congress, we had a nearly 100-year-old history of rebellion against the colonial hegemony by the people from the most indigenous sections of the society, and that some of these rebellions lasted for years together, and they were all put down with a ferocious forces by the colonial administration. And there is another interesting dimension about this whole thing is that there was this particular class of people within the Indian community. They have joined or collaborated with the colonial administration to suppress these movements. And one of the ways of this primitive accumulation by this the emergent or a nascent section of the so-called Indian trading class was basically from the money they have gained by giving assistance to this colonial suppression or movement. So these are all some of the issues which has not been properly flagged in the history writing in India, and that kind of a history writing or that kind of a perspective was first developed by the subaltern school of history writing. And this subaltern school, of course, in the later part of it, especially after the 2000 this thing, it became a kind of an entirely cultural turn, and then it has become a kind of a very postmodern kind of ideas, and that needed to be critiqued. But what I wanted to say is that on this particular chapter of this book, what I wanted to say is that what Comrade Ajit has brought forward is that although this whole idea of postmodernism and their especially their hostility towards anything connected with Marxism or anything connected with the politics of emancipation or the communist project, some of these issues flagged by them deserves a closer scrutiny and a closer attention. So with these opening remarks, I would like to hand over the mic to Saurav, and I would like Mr. Saurav to have a kind of a focus on this particular aspect which I have now discussed, and I think that Saurav can speak on it now.
Yeah, thank you, Setu. So, what do you say regarding the subaltern school as the beginning of post-colonial theory? Is actually right, because all the post-colonial theories that we see today are there in the academia are actually the ones who were before this was actually subaltern school people. So you mentioned one book of Ranajit Go. So there is another one, very famous of him, Dominance and Hegemony. So there, if you see, he talks about the question of universalism, the problem that which Ajit has actually pointed out. The problem, what begins with post-coloniality, is a question of universalism. That whether we can see everything as a universal law or not. So in actually trying to build things in that way, they have also uh, tried to portray Marxism in their own ways, which Marxism uh, did not actually try to interpret itself. So if you see the book that I was telling about, he discusses there that why we see that the Indian bourgeoisie is much different from that of Western one. And there he tries to search for the bourgeois in a very Western manner that we find in Europe. And the problem begins from there. If you see, I mean, this has been critiqued for a long time. It started actually from Sumit Sarkar, who actually left the subaltern school, critiquing the fact that the subaltern school, whatever it started with, it moved away from that. It drifted away from that. And then in recent years, we have seen Vivek Chiber's big debate with the subaltern and post-colonial school. Actually, he started with the post-colonial school only, but then he brought out this point that it started along with the subaltern school, because what the subaltern school actually sketched out laid the foundations of the post-colonial theory. So all these problems together has given rise to the very political problems and the theoretical problems that the left in India are facing today in terms of organizing protests and programs and everywhere. So what Ajit, I think, attempts with his book is to deal with all these questions. And in that attempt, I think he has more than succeeded with that. He actually points out various facts that how the question of post-coloniality, the post-colonial theory, which keeps on stressing the point that India or the erstwhile colonial countries is somewhat beyond colonialism, which in a way actually negates neocolonialism. The fact never talks about the law of, you know, the universalization of the law of capital. That's what is main factor here. So I think it's better that Ajit talk about it from here.
Thank you, Saurabh. This subaltern school, I agree with Sedu that it did bring out a new perspective on history, brought out a lot of unknown facts, and opened up a whole new venue, not just one, but many venues of research. But right around this period that this whole history writing was going on, there was another movement developing in Bengal and across the country, the Naxalbari movement, which was actually very subaltern. It connected with the most basic level of the society, energized them and brought them out onto the field of struggle. And that formed the basis of a huge churning up in the intellectual classes and the middle classes and all that. I mean, the reason I'm trying to point out this is that the tradition of Marxist historiography in India, particularly linked to the CPI and later CPM and all that, excluding some very rare exceptions like D.D. Kosambi and Rahul Sampradaya, was extremely mechanical and leftist version of the nationalist history, rather than breaking away with that whole thing and addressing the issue from the standpoint of the basic classes, from the proletarian standpoint. Because while the subalterns were, I mean, the school of history was taking up these issues and all that, and trying to differentiate this all these movements from the elite as they characterized it, and then naturally that logically led up to this conclusion that the Communist Party itself was also another elite, and thereby excluding the whole thing of the question of the leadership, of the leading ideology and all these questions, sort of liquidating all that. We have another example at a very different corner of the world, from Latin America, from Peru, where we had a person like Carlos Mariátegui quite accurately observing that the national question in Peru is a question of the Indians there. I mean, the basic indigenous masses there. That from his Marxist perspective, he could understand that issue. Whereas if you look at the, the socio-political cultural milieu of these countries, which have been heavily colonized by European powers, Spain and all that, where the language is dominantly European, culture is dominantly European and all that. A Marxist leader being able to pierce through all that and accurately observe that the national question is precisely the question of the indigenous population of that country. So what I'm saying is that these things were there. Of course, Mariátegui was not well known at that time, as he is nowadays. But even then, surely it is not that he was unknown also. As far as I know, he was being taught in several universities and all that. So one has to understand that there is a certain class perspective that is coming up here, which is I have tried to point out that on the one hand, what is a positive or something that we have to accept, or accept basically from this whole post-colonial, postmodernism and all that, is the unsettling that it has carried out. By challenging given concepts and all these things, there is an unsettling. And naturally that opens up a lot of new venues. But one must also realize that this unsettling or the unpacking, as some of them characterize it, is quite selective. In fact, in that very essay, I've given an example of how, on the one hand, the author is keenly unpacking several concepts and all that. But on the other hand, he say for example, the question of the population, where he says that Modi is able to activate the population and to carry out their fascist aims and all that. And this whole population, there is no unpacking of that concept, of the classes involved in it, the various social sections involved, nothing of that sort. So one can see that there are a very clear line is drawn of to what extent one can unsettle or what extent one can unpack. And what I understand is that as far as Marxism is concerned, as far as the proletarian standpoint view is concerned, there is no such limit to its unpacking. It is able to go to the very roots of the issue. And that is the Marxist approach, basically. So this is what I've been trying to drive in that essay. So on the one hand, you have all these theories and all that, new theories, new insights, new analysis, new research, which do bring up a lot of material which was unknown earlier, and also help us develop a broader perspective of society, of what actually was going on here and what is going on here now. But on the other hand, precisely because of the class limitation of that viewpoint, it creates a barricade where what it claims to be doing, it fails in that. It isn't able to deliver its promise. So though it starts by saying that we are going to unsettle and unpack and all this thing, it ends up halfway as a tame affair, which gets accommodated once again into the ruling classes, what do you say, ideological apparatus and all these things, serving it in the unknowingly, unwittingly, or whatever. So that is the issue that I would like to stress here in this matter. That's all.
To what Ajit said, I would like to just add a few things. Should I?
Yeah.
So Ajit brought up a very important issue that while the subaltern school was actually emerging, there was a big movement, there was a big social upheaval there in Bengal, and it was spreading all over India. So if you see the lifetime of the subaltern school, it was active in 80s, it was ongoing till 90s. It never tried to address this question that presently what is going on. They began with the very Gramscian notion of the subaltern, because Ranajit Ghosh was the one who sketched the very basics of this methodology of subaltern school. Actually, Sumit Sarkar pointed out very well. He said there is any in the subaltern school, there are hardly subalterns there. It's hardly subalterns who are talking about themselves. People are all time talking about bringing up the question of subalternity and subalterns, but hardly it's the subaltern voice. So that's the thing. I mean, that's the question where it gets diverted. The immediate issue never gets addressed. And in the history of Marxist historiography, if you say, there is one person who is emerging in a parallel with this school, but he's giving a very different perspective of the Indian history, and that is Suniti Kumar Ghosh.
Yeah,
we all know that his books are coming up, and he's giving a very different, and he's actually breaking away with the old mechanical thinking of Marxism, which the subaltern school is actually pointing out to portray what Marxism actually is. I mean, that's what I was trying to say, that every time there has been a refutation, it's always there has been a portrayal of this is what actually Marxism is. But Marxism actually continued to flourish on various streams, but this kind of school never actually tried to bring out or even talk about it.
Yeah. Here, I would like to highlight another point in this connection. This whole what is called the subaltern school in India, or even before that in Europe, there was a kind of a shift from this Marxism, especially in Europe in the 19 after the 1916s rebellions really got petered out after this thing, and the most radical history of, I mean, radical events which has dominated Europe at on those days, France. This revision or this return has happened in France, especially with the French New School. They were the one who rejected Marxism, and then that you can trace a kind of a complete shift towards the right, an ideological right or ideological backlash has been taking place, and there is a kind of a continuity of that kind of a rightward shift in this ideology, especially from Marxism, and then coming out with all kinds of schools, as Ajit says, postisms, post-Marxism, post-structuralism, all kinds of postisms are there. So even today, when we are talking about the emergence of a new right, or even Trumpism, or even Modi, these are all kind of a linkages towards this kind of a rightward shift, and we have to even locate this whole post-colonial narrative is it also possible to locate this post-colonial narrative within this kind of a rightward shift that has taken place on a global level? And because especially there is a trend by all these schools that they have a tendency to see their enemies only on their left. They never see their enemies on their right. So is it I mean, one more thing I wanted to highlight on this point is that, of course, that has been mentioned somewhere and in Ajit's this thing about the way the American establishment, especially the CIA, played in promoting these kind of ideas. Now there is a lot of works coming out highlighting how there is, in fact, even when CIA read the French theory kind of books are coming out showing how exactly they have promoted this idea as a kind of a counter to Marxism, or the idea of a liberation and the idea of these things. So how and all these things are appearing in a new forms or new formats in many places, whether including in India or even in Latin America or in many places. So I would like both Saurav and Ajit to touch upon these points, how this ideological war is being played out at the global level and also in this thing, and how exactly it is going to, how important to highlight such facts.
Well, you said about the 60s rebellion in France. So soon after that, you can see that in Chile, a historical thing is happening. A new school is coming up. It's called neoliberal school, which is going for it's making Chile as their laboratory. So neoliberalism is coming up. Neoliberalism is coming up as a reaction to the global capitalism's crisis in the 50s and 70s. Actually, it's not only 50s and 70s, it's the crisis of global capitalism right after the Second World War. What started after the Second World War. So you can see this it has a very you can some call it coincidence, but it doesn't seem like a coincidence that these two things are coming up. On the one hand, it's the new left. First, it's new left, then it's post-Marxism, and then several other isms and thoughts and this kind of critiques are coming up and breaking away things are happening. So the first declaration is the breaking down of the grand narrative that the French theorists are bringing out, that the grand narrative is failing. It's the fractional discourses that matters. So, and the thing that happened is that the temporary setback of Marxism, the temporary setback of the Marxism that is faced due to the revisionism in USSR and all that was happening in globally. On the one hand, there was a revolutionary movement that was coming up, and on the other hand, we can see revisionism was having its adverse effect on various communist parties and left groups. So the temporary void that was being created, that was created on the left, was served with these new ideologies, which was coming up with these new languages and new, what you call, jargons. So that's the way I see it. And the point that you're telling about the CIA thing, mostly the university new left that still exists today in the student, actually the student society. It's a big thing being this new left. So they are always enraged with the fact that how can you say CIA was plotting all this. You just cannot accept the fact that Marxism had actually crisis. The point was not actually that, because Marxism was actually proceeding in another path, and it was just the history, the theory, and the ways are less talked about. And this type of theories or this type of ideologies was promoted, and these were actually promoted in universities and academic spaces. So I think that the emergence of neoliberalism and coming up of all these ideas are not merely coincidence. I think Ajit can speak on this.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, I think you've covered most of the points. But I would like to touch on a different aspect, and the aspect related to what we were speaking about earlier, in the sense that this whole setback that took place in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev's seizure of power and all that, capitalist order's seizure of power, and the split that took place in the communist camp as a result of that, as well as what you say, the high tide of the national liberation movements that was there, anti-colonial movements that was there till the early 60s, mid 60s, on that, start slowly ebbing away. So overall, there was a condition, and in that situation, though you had students, what do you say, upsurges and all these things going on at various parts of the world, there was a certain ideological vacuum, particularly in European countries. Now, the interesting thing is that right at around this time, you had ideological breakthroughs going on in China under Mao Zedong's leadership, the critique of Soviet economy, various new advances in practice, the Cultural Revolution and all that. Of course, it had its impact on the Western world and all that. But if you actually look at to what extent was this absorbed by the intellectual sections in the Western world, those who had come from a Marxist background, you see that it was not much. And I think there is a very strong factor of Eurocentrism, which sort of dismissed this whole thing. That's, some exotic Oriental stuff, and nothing more than that. And it cannot be, taken up in the same glorious philosophical tradition as that of the West, which still is able to give a place to a Lenin and all that, but not to a Mao. So this factor, I think, has to be also taken into account. And this outlook and all that. And in that regard, coming to the point that we were speaking about earlier, post-colonialism, we can see that the post-colonial critique of Orientalism and of various such aspects, for example, the concept of provincialism that was advanced by one among the subaltern school, these did have a positive role in resisting this Eurocentric school of thought, dominant thought, so to say. But as I mentioned earlier, the point is that this is also moving away from a really revolutionary attempt to understand society and analyze it and confront it. Which I think is quite, one has to look at it from the aspect of its class basis. When you have things like the Cultural Revolution going on, when you have breakthroughs being made from a Marxist perspective in theory there also, why is it that is not absorbed? Why is it that is not made into an input or an insight? Or as I pointed out earlier, Naxalbari movement going on right around the time of subaltern movement. And why is it that the potential of that movement the fact that it was able to galvanize thousands and thousands of middle class youth, students, very bright, intelligent students, to leave their studies and go to the masses and all that. Why is it that this was not actually assimilated or taken up by these people? There, I think this factor of, I mean, CIA and all that have played a role, no doubt about it. But they were able to play a role precisely because there was a certain conducive situation there. And that, I think, is the crux of the matter. That's all.
I think we are now coming towards the last 10 minutes of our discussions, and I would like to focus on, because there are many issues dealt in Comrade Ajit's book, and obviously we don't have the time to go through all those points raised in this book, which deserves a detailed attention. But two things which I would like to focus on is that this idea about the Maoist party and the vanguard, the role of the vanguard. And of course, and that is also in the particular Indian context, the role of Brahmanism again in perpetuating a kind of the present Indian ruling class in this thing. On the idea of the Maoist party and the vanguard, Comrade Ajit is very specific, saying that although a kind of a theoretical break has been achieved in terms of a Maoist party, in terms of practice, it is still a work in progress, because we are not having a, what do you call, a kind of a Maoist party per se. We are still having what is called a Leninist party, or what. I mean, I don't know whether it is correct to make a kind of such a kind of a segregation. That is one thing which we would like to have a discussion on this thing, and I would like Saurav also to comment on this. And secondly, the specific role of Brahmanism in what is the kind of role, I mean, in terms of as a kind of an ideology it is playing. I mean, it remains still a kind of an elusive thing, we can't touch it upon, or a kind of a thing, like we say about a Western capitalism or something like, it is a concrete, the bourgeois is there. The Brahmanism, whether we will be able to say like that about the Indian situation or not. I mean, I would like both Saurav and Ajit to comment on that. I think that we'll have time for that.
Yeah, so both things I see together very much interrelated, because as Ajit points out on his book, that the question of caste is actually, the question of caste has been dealt. It has been dealt in academic manner, in various manner, but we have to see the question of caste in link with global imperialism and bureaucrat capitalism. That's what the crux of caste works in India. So Brahminism is something that Ajit says in his book. I think it's something that Ambedkar said long ago, that it extends way beyond Brahmins. It extends way beyond the Brahmins, and it has seeped down to the very grassroots level of the society in our consciousness. So the problems that Ajit's book bring out regarding the question of vanguard in waging revolution or the movement in India, it deals with the problem of what is popularly called the identity politics question, that the various different sections of the society, let's say gender, caste, they're all trying to make their own point, trying to represent the problems that they are facing. Here, Ajit deals with it in a Maoist way, that one divides into two. So, and he also tells that in his book, he discusses in a beautiful way that the vanguard party have to listen to all these problems. They must integrate with the masses, know their problems, even if they are against the party for the moment. The vanguard must work with them because they must understand that it is their limitation that they cannot assimilate them with them for the moment. And that's how the mass work actually uh, continues. And that's why that Ajit actually discusses in his essay, The Maoist Party, that why we need a new kind of party, the party that actually uh, is based upon all this, who actually seriously deals and considers all this, because it has always been a big point against the Leninist party that it is too rigid, and it has actually created the evils of Stalinism, etc., etc. But the Maoist party is something the Mao begin with a criticism of the earlier experience. It was built with experience, earlier experience, but again, it's a very Marxist law of negation through which it began. And therefore, I think the question that of Brahmanism and the new form of vanguard is actually quite interlinked. That we cannot have emancipatory politics with the old kind of communist parties which think themselves to be vanguard but acts in the very Brahminical system, because they have absorbed the very Brahminical what do you call aspects in which they operate. That's why they cannot think beyond the parliamentary questions and peaceful struggles and reformisms. Exactly. I think Ajit can reflect more on this.
I'd like to clarify that it's not that I think that, what you say, there is a Leninist party and then there is also another thing known as a Maoist party, because I think that what Mao did was to develop the party concept as advanced by Marx and then later developed by Lenin also, who made a big breakthrough in that matter actually. So Mao had tried to synthesize all these experiences, but it was a work in progress. And as I pointed out in that essay, a book which sort of summarized most of the lessons of that was learned by the China Communist Party during that period. It came out in a book form only in 1974. And before it could be properly broadcast or taken all throughout the world to the Maoist forces and all that, the capitalist restoration took place in China, and this was one of the first books to be banned by them. So this aspect is there. Now the other thing is that yes, it's true that it's a work in something. It's a, what is a work in progress, because a vanguard, I think that it's always a work in progress, not just as a matter of the Maoist party, because as I pointed out in that essay, you have a whole array of new forces out, active socially, active politically, and making themselves heard through their struggles and articulation of their views and all that. So this, in such a thriving atmosphere, the vanguard is bound to continuously remake itself, to learn from these things, movements going on, as well as develop its understanding, to develop its policies, etc. So this whole process of remaking itself is an ongoing process. And that's only how it can actually retain that vitality and its quality as a vanguard. So there is another thing there that what I stress is that a vanguard is still necessary as a vital necessity if one is serious about making a revolution. And that is where it differentiates from this whole concept of the rainbow coalition and all that, which was heralded as a big contribution of Chavismo. And one can see what is actually going on in Venezuela today, that's not the fact. Now, when we look at this whole related to this question of Brahminism, I think that one cannot, what do you say, unlike bourgeoisie or a class force, one cannot that way materially identify this Brahminism. It's an ideology. And ideology actually is of the classes. So you have the comprador bourgeois class as well as the feudal classes in India, and Brahminism is their ideology. Now, this Brahminism, the Brahminism that we are now dealing with, particularly in India, that of the RSS, the Sangha Parivar and all that, this is a creation of colonialism. One must keep that very much in mind. It's not the old Brahminism of the Veda period and all that, though of course it has links with it and all that. It has its roots there. It is a very modern thing, developed and articulated according to the needs of these new classes. Because the feudals are also not the old feudals. They have to have transformed themselves. New forces have been added to that. And then there is the leading factor of the comprador bureaucrat bourgeoisie, which is an absolutely modern class created by imperialism and all that, colonialism. So this is the Brahminism that is suited to it. Now, to confront that, a communist party must definitely analyze how this Brahminism is operating in our society. And here there is an interesting thing that we can take a lesson from, which I would like to point out is that, for example, the campaign that was carried out in China of criticizing Confucius and Lin Piao. Now, I need not go into more details about this Lin Piao business and all that, but the point is that why did they relate Confucius and Lin Piao? They did not say it was not a campaign solely limited to Lin Piao or one solely related to Confucius, but rather one that was linking together. And what was common there? The common thing, I think, was the subservience that was being advanced by Confucius to authority, and which precisely was what Lin Piao was also playing upon. On the one hand, quite artificially boosting up Mao, his authority and etc. and all that thing, and under that pursuing his own rightist agenda. So this whole thing of this, what Marxism calls on the masses or its own cadres and forces and all that, is not subservience, but rather a critical thinking and capacity to engage with the real issues of society at all its levels and realms and all that. Because that precisely is the whole issue of Brahminism also, because Brahminism demands subservience. There are certain principles, certain tenets, etc., which one has to, what do you say, accept and follow, and that's it. Critical thinking or going beyond that or challenging these ideas are not allowed. So this, I think, is where we have to keep in this whole point. If you look at the way that Mao developed the concept of vanguard and all that, one sees a very close relation, which would be very fruitful for further advance later. That's all.
Okay. Okay, thank you. That was a very interesting and lively discussion. So, comrades, remember that this is a webinar, so the only way that you guys can interact with the audience is through asking questions with the Q&A icon you have in the bottom of your screen. So if you have any question, please submit them now. We'll now go to Comrade Ajit for his summary of the discussion. So once again, Comrade, it's your...
Am I muted or not? No, I'm okay, fine. Okay, I mean, yes, as you said, it's been an interesting discussion, brought in a few angles which I had not actually much thought about earlier. Now, this collection of essays is actually, it's a bit difficult to, address it as a single thing, though it's come out as a single book, because it deals with a lot of various differing topics. There's one on post-isms of post-colonialism and all that. There is an essay on the laws of history, and you have the vanguard, Maoist party, and all these things. But at the same time, there is a certain theme that is connecting all of that, which on the one of that is the, what do you say, was an attempt to grapple with the new issues that have come up in theory as well as in practice. And at the same time, an attempt to apply this theory in analyzing the social reality that we are existing in. For example, that article on the particular Brahminist basis of the fascism that we are now facing here in India, or the article essay on the reservation issue, where I start off by examining how is it that we see the Savarna youth who 10 or 15 years earlier were out on the streets demanding an end to caste reservation, caste-based reservation, are now going for the exact opposite. They are demanding caste-based reservation for themselves. So what actually is the dynamics underlying this, and trying to analyze it that from the Maoist standpoint by bringing in the question of bureaucratic capitalism, all these things. So this is one of the themes that is underlying this whole essay, which deals with quite apparently disparate issues. And as far as the, what do you say, the theoretical issues which need further probing and all that is concerned, I think that precisely this issue of postisms, of its various offshoots, and what do you say, the way it's been worked out in the theory, and how its practical articulation comes up as an obstacle to actually address the real social issues that we are facing. One of the examples I had given about that population in the earlier discussion is a good example of that. There are other similar things. And most importantly, in this haste to deny universalisms, to insist on the particular, there is a, what do you say, a conscious or unconscious, what do you say, hiding up of, covering up of the universalism that was actually existing here. Not the Western one, but I'm speaking about the universalism that was existing in the so-called Orient, related to the earlier feudal period and ruling classes ideology and all these things. So there is a sort of a reverse Orientalism, you could say, in this matter, which then very clearly, or rather very easily, it can adjust or go along with the Sangha Parivar's, the RSS attack on Marxism by declaring it that it's a whole Western thing and it's got nothing to do with us and our traditions and all these things. So I think that is a point that would deserve further probing and further analysis, further critical thinking. And I hope that my book would be a occasion or rather a reason or a spur for taking up that sort of a project. That's all. Thank you. So I think if there are questions and all that, we could get into that.
Yeah, thank you, Ajit. Yeah, so we will now open for the questions, and you have to unmute and make.
Should I mute? Unmute?
No, it's good. Okay. Okay, so we have many questions that were asked. If you comrades want to ask a particular question to the author, to Saurav, to KP Setunat, please write it in the question. Otherwise, I will consider that your question is overall for all of the panel. The first question that we have arrived to us like at the very beginning of the webinar. So I believe that the comrade who sent that to us from the Philippines really want to know the answer to that. In one of your essay, Ajit, in the essay on the vanguard in the 21st century, you described Chavismo as a failed project. So the comrade wanted to ask you what is the role that imperialism played in this, in the failure of this project, in particular the Chinese imperialism.
He needs to unmute.
Yeah, you're muted, Ajit.
My information, my knowledge of what's actually had happened in Venezuela and what's going on now is quite limited. Whatever I can get from reading some journals and newspaper articles and all that. And it was quite limited also by my enforced stay as a government guest also. So, but the basic point that I'm trying to drive is that, look, imperialism has always tried to overturn or overthrow any force which has been opposed to it. Imperialism in the sense that one or the other imperialist power. And now, so far as the United States is concerned, they consider South America as their backyard, and they have been all along trying to keep it totally under their control. So when you have a person like Hugo Chavez coming up and criticizing or challenging it to even to a limited extent, naturally they'll go all out to overthrow that person, pull him down. But the most important thing is that to what extent was the whole ideology, the politics, the policy of this Chavez project focused on actually breaking with imperialism at all levels of its relations, of Venezuela's relations with imperialism as a global system, not just with American imperialism or this or that other imperialist forces. So when this is missing, then naturally it fails to mobilize the masses. They really unleash the masses, their revolutionary capacity and all that. And naturally it gives room for maneuver and manipulation by other forces. Now in that, as far as I know, Chinese imperialism is trying to push its way quite vigorously into South America. Naturally, it would be trying to, utilize this opportunity. And here, the lesson given by Mao is very important, I think, that one must beware of the, wolf coming through the back door while trying to drive the tiger away from the front door. So this sort of a situation could very much be there in Venezuela. But an interesting development, I think, now in this recent period is that there is some new polarization that is emerging within this camp that was broadly known as the Chauvist camp earlier. So what extent is it radical? To what extent is it breaking away from that whole Chauvism project and all that? I don't know. But that seems to be a promising development.
Okay, interesting. Has the other panelists maybe something to add to that?
No, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we will move to the other question we receive. So here we have a question from the Professor Mufad Paul from Canada that is asking, can you speak about how the dialectics of universality particularity, which emerge often in your collection of books, of essays, is used to address what you've noted in the overall theme of the book, grappling with new theories and this social reality?
That's a very, very big question. One sentence, but it covers a lot of things. Well, basically, I think this whole question of universality and particularity and all that, Marxism is a universal theory. I mean, ideology is universal, but the development of that ideology has always taken place by addressing specific concrete issues, whether it's of social issues or whether it is of theoretical issues of the theoretical type. It has been always advanced by addressing particularities, because that is actually how things work out. And it is by addressing these particularities that you develop new insights, which then help you understand other features. Now, one of the most damaging aspects of this whole postmodernism is that by denying this whole role of universality, in the name of overturning or rejecting meta-narratives and all that, the potential for, taking up this insights that you gain from a particular field of study for application and other things, this at one level it is broken away. At the level of theory, that is rejected. And it's very interesting to note that this is taking place at a time wherein the sciences, interdisciplinary study has become quite a rage. And more scientists are now admitting the necessity of taking up that sort of a study. Whereas we have here at the level of philosophy and academics and all that, a situation where things are getting compartmentalized in the name of avoiding universalisms and meta-narratives and all that. So I'll just leave it at that, because to go into the question more deeply would require another big discussion altogether.
Okay. We have here another question. We will go back to the discussion you had earlier about the subaltern. The comrade that sent us this question was saying that the notion of the subaltern was first time referred by Gramsci in his note on Italian history. But now the modern subaltern thinkers say that the approach using subaltern study consists mainly in retracing the concept of the subaltern in its historical development, as it was first used by Gramsci. Would you agree with that, or do you think that that Gramsci concepts have already been distorted?
I think that's addressed to Setu.
No, it is addressed to you. But I can say that the subaltern school, especially Ranjit Guha in his work, has acknowledged Gramsci. He never said that he is inventing something on his own, but he based his whole theoretical premise on this Gramscian idea of subaltern. And also to add on to that, in his elementary aspects of peasant struggle, he had in fact referred to the Naxalbari revolt as a motivating factor for taking up this kind of a study and this kind of an approach in his in that work. And so I don't think that there is any, at least till the early part of that work, there is any conflict with the Gramscian concept of subaltern. But what Gramsci meant by subaltern is the same thing meant by the subaltern school. That is, I think, a different subject of debate.
I mean, isn't there another question also here that, I mean, when Gramsci was saying subaltern, what exactly was he meaning?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying.
And in the sense that we know that he was writing from prison, he had to put things in a way that would get past the censor. Because if you look through what he was writing about the subaltern, about its role, I mean, what's going on in Italian history and all that, it would be more, I mean, I think if he was writing that while he was outside, without having to worry about the censor, he would have used a different language altogether to describe that. Because he was describing the class struggles and all that was going on there, particularly the role of the peasantry and all that. So I think that, I mean, to talk about a Gramscian concept of subaltern, as if that is some new category that he developed other than that of classes, and I don't think that's really accurate in doing justice to what he was trying to do. Because there is the problem of this language. If you look through that collection of essays now, and I've mentioned that in the preface also, I've left that language as such. Because it was written while in jail, and
Yeah.
with the idea that I might not be able to come out to get it published, I'll have to send it out from jail. So I had to be very careful about the language I was using. And one could very well come to the conclusion that this fellow is trying to put some sort of a reformist program. Or instead of spelling out what is to be done, he is sort of avoiding it and speaking of other things. So this constriction, this limitation, one has to keep in mind, I think, when you deal with Gramsci's writings. Even more than in my case, of course.
Yeah, of course, that we can see from if we just take a look at his pre-prison writings.
Yeah.
His usage of language is very different, and it makes it clear that why he was using a very different language while he was in jail, because he has to get all his manuscript passed through the fascist authorities. So all these new academic uh, writings about Gramsci inventing a new category of people, I don't think that's something that Gramsci wanted to. He was just using a different language because he was in jail. Very few people in the academia who deals with Gramscian, uh, this subalternity and Gramscian ideology. Very few people have came across who actually reads Gramsci's pre-prison writings. They are all reading up his prison writings and telling it's a new kind of theory that he's talking about, but not really.
Okay. Here we have a question coming from Turkey. So in the Maoist party, you discussed the way that like the teachings of Mao were systematically compiled in 1974 in the basic understanding of the Communist Party of China, particularly his concept of the party. Now another element that was tried to be like attributed to Mao was the notion of the three-word theory after his death. So the comrade from Turkey is saying that in Turkey we reject that. What would be your opinion, and in general the opinion of comrades in India about this, the theory of the three words? Yeah.
Well, in India too, the overwhelmingly it has been rejected. There are, of course, certain sections which have upheld it, continue to uphold it also, I believe, who consider it to be Mao's theory. But it has been very well established by Maoists that whole three worlds theory as such is not Mao's creation. But he has mentioned about the division of the world into three, which is a very broad categorization. One can see similar categorizations made by Lenin also. At that time of the international situation, we had the two superpowers and we had the lesser imperialist powers, and then of course the broader category of the oppressed nations, which was characterized as the third world. But as the theory that came out after Mao's death, which was presented as a strategic line of the international communist movement, actually called for uniting with US imperialism and the Western imperialist powers to, confront or face up to Soviet social imperialism. And insisting that this should be the line, strategic line of all the communist parties, which was obviously a revisionist, a new revisionist version of the same peaceful coexistence, the collaborative policies of Khrushchev and all that, it is in earlier time. So it's clear that it has got nothing to do with Mao. So I would differentiate between these things, three world theory as such, as well as the division of the world into three as a broad categorization of the world situation, which is not relevant today that way.
Okay. Here I have another question from a comrade from the US that corrected me. He's not from the Philippines. I'm sorry, comrade. The comrade is asking about the question of linguistics. So postmodernism always delve into the terrain of linguistics. But would you think that there is still a place for linguistic that would not be haunted by postmodernism? Is this even debate important? What's your take on that?
And I really don't have much of an idea about linguistics and all that. It's not been my field of study. But I think that, postmodernism and all sorts of other theories have always been there in, philosophical intellectual world. But that does not mean that any specific line of study and all that should get dismissed just because postmodernism has messed up the situation or some other theory has messed up the situation. Because the study of language and its role, not just as communication in philosophy and all that, it's a very important field of study. And I believe South Asia had a very strong history in philosophy of linguistic studies. There are certain modern philosophers who even consider that much of the South Asian debate on linguistics foreshadowed the contemporary debates going on in the linguistic field of linguistic studies and all that. So my point is that any field of study would have its value, no matter what postmodernism or some other theory distorts it and uses it for its own views and purposes and all that. That's all.
Okay. Okay. Here we have another question coming from, I think, Kerala. What would be the semi-feudal and semi-colonial framework? Why would you think that India is still a semi-feudal and semi-colonial country? What are the possible explanations for that?
Why do I think so? Is because that is a fact. What more can I say about it? But I think the problem that a lot of people who raise this question is that they don't understand the whole concept of bureaucrat capitalism. What is the particularity of the capitalism that has been implanted here and developed here by imperialism? Not just here, in all the broader third world countries, oppressed countries and all that. It is not the capitalism that came up in the Western countries. Because the basic characteristic of that capitalism was that in one way or the other, it had to settle accounts with feudalism, get rid of feudalism, either through violent, upheaval or revolution, or through other means. But the whole thing was settled. But here, we want to see a capitalism that has been nurtured by imperialism without eliminating feudalism. And that is the particularity. So as a result, no matter how much this bureaucrat capitalism is developed, it will always regenerate one or the other form of feudalism. And that is why it has that semi-feudalism. As far as the semi-colonial aspect of it, it's because there are several imperialist countries dominating and exploiting India and the other third world countries of the world. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So thank you very much, comrades. That was a lot of interesting questions. We have a lot of questions, so but unfortunately, we don't have the time to answer to all of them. We just have to hope that Comrade Ajit will write another book to answer to all of your questions.
I should know what the questions are. Will you pass on all those questions?
Yeah, but yeah, if you want to know more about the topics discussed tonight, well, you can read the book, and it's like a prelude to the book. Yeah, to read the book, you can order it on our web shop. We'll put a link right after the webinar. It's already up. Yeah. So yeah, I would like to really thank everybody for participating. Thank Comrade Ajit, Sourav, Setu, and yeah, and thank you very much, comrades.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we can wind up. Yeah.